Well, I'm not well-versed in the quotable movie, Princess Bride. But I know one line because it's repeated throughout the movie. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. There we go. And if you're not well-versed, some of you are looking at me, you're like, he's too young to know that. If you don't know, it's okay, but when you think about that quote, it answers two questions. Who is he, and why did he come? His name is Inigo Montoya. I'm going to kill you because you killed my father. Who is he? Why did he come? And when you really simple down the Gospel of Mark, he answers these two questions. Who is Jesus Christ, and why did he come? And Mark is 16 chapters. He spends the first 8 chapters answering this first question, and it climaxes in chapter 8, what we talked about last week. When Jesus is looking at his disciples and he says, who do people say that I am? Some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say Elijah. And then Peter stands up and says, you're the Christ. And so the first question is answered in the first half of Mark. And as we make the turn to answering the second question, we find ourselves in the middle of the gospel today. And we're with the person of power, Jesus, heading to the place of power, Jerusalem. We're on this journey to Jerusalem about to answer the second question. And here Jesus answers it. What have you come to do? 3 times, just like Inigo. I've come to die. It is inevitable. He has come to die. I am Jesus the Christ, and I have come to die. And what is inevitable to him is unthinkable to the disciples. Because every time he says it, they're just like, what? Huh? Can we ask you about that? And so their lack of comprehension leads us to this great symmetry in 3 chapters. So we get chapters 8, 9, and 10. In each chapter, Jesus says, I am going to die and rise. And in each chapter, or each moment after that, the disciples are like confused or there's tension. And so after each death prediction, there's a discipleship lesson. So 3 death predictions, 3 discipleship lessons. By looking at the thing as a whole, I want us to look at the nature of his death and the nature of our discipleship. First, the nature of his death. 3 times Jesus says, start 8:31, Son of Man must suffer and be killed. After 3 days, rise again. 9:31, Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men and they'll kill him. And when he's killed, after 3 days, he will rise. Chapter later in 10:33, he says, see, we are going to Jerusalem and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, deliver him over to the Gentiles. And then he gets more graphic with this third prediction. He says, they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him, and after 3 days, he'll rise. Notice the language. He says, the Son of Man must suffer. He will die. He is going to be killed. There is no hesitancy or uncertainty in his voice. Here's the answer to the second question. The Son of Man is set on dying. And so the first thing we see about the nature of his death is that it is inevitable. The death of Jesus Christ is not a tragic accident. It is not, Jesus had a good run, and then 4th quarter he tore his Achilles. He had to go that way. It wasn't an accident, it's a divine mission. He's saying this must happen, this will happen. And each time he tells them, the disciples are baffled and confused, like, what? No, you're the person of power taking us to the place of power where the kingdom's supposed to reign. When they heard Son of Man, they thought Daniel 7, which said, a Son of Man will be given dominion, glory, and a kingdom over all peoples, nations, and languages. It shall not pass away nor be destroyed. And the disciples are like, that's our guy, the Son of Man, taking us to dominion, taking us to the kingdom. And what they missed was the prophet Isaiah spoke of this same person. Isaiah 52 and 53 says, behold, my servant shall be high, lifted up, exalted. Kings shall shut their mouths at this man. And the disciples are like, that's our guy. But then Isaiah goes on to say, he'll be stricken, smitten, afflicted, pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. He'll take the punishment that brings us peace. By his wounds will be healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, but the Lord will lay on him the iniquity of us all. and what Jesus is doing is taking these two seemingly competing views, a conquering king and a suffering servant, and saying, I am. I am the king who has a cross. I am the Son of Man that must suffer. I am the Christ that must die. In Harry Potter translation, I am the boy who lived, come to die. And I've also come to rise because Jesus Christ came. He's saying, I have come not to conquer Rome, not to conquer culture, not to conquer Greece. I have come to conquer something that is outside you and within you. I've come to conquer sin and death. That is why he must die. That is why it is inevitable that he must die. And some of you may hear that and say, this is the exact reason I don't mess with Christianity. Because it sounds just like those old, archaic, barbaric, bloodthirsty religions where there's an angry God and someone has to bleed. It's like, it's nasty. And I would just say, if that's where you are right now, it begs another question. What happened on that cross? Why did he come to die? The cross of Jesus Christ, him dying, will be the reason that you either see the God of the Bible as barbaric and bloodthirsty or beautiful. And so we must answer the question, why did he come to die? And so we learn that his death is not just inevitable, but Jesus will tell us that it is transactional. After he gives his third prediction, he tells us why he came to die. He says, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. 3 words there answer, why did Jesus Christ come to die? The first, he came. Like, he didn't get drafted by God as a 13-year-old on the kickball field. It wasn't like, Jesus, you're a good kid. Well, you'll be elevated to God one day. No, this was the Word who was with God in the beginning. This is fully God, Jesus Christ, who spoke you and I and the world into existence, and he entered humanity. First word came, second word ransom. A ransom was a payment made for the release of slaves or the release of something. So to ransom something was to redeem it. What he's saying when he says, I've come to give my life as a ransom, is that a transaction is necessary. His death is transactional. In other words, to make sense of it, in the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. In the beginning, God said, let there be vegetation, and there was vegetation. What God can't do is say, let there be forgiveness, and there's forgiveness. Why? Because as Pastor Ben articulated so well last week, if you violate an eternal God, you have to pay eternity, unless someone eternal steps in your story. If you violate an eternal God, your debt is eternal. Sin assumes a debt, and therefore forgiveness must deal with this debt. And so if you are to be forgiven, an eternal debt has to be dealt with. And that's where the third word, he came as a ransom, and it says for. For just means in place of or instead of. And so those 3 words put together is the answer of why did the God-man come to die? Jesus Christ came to die as a payment in your place, a substitutionary sacrifice. And therefore, what you have is this worldview pitted against every other one. Because you can't just say, oh, the God of the Bible is a bloodthirsty God. This is one of those archaic, bloodthirsty, barbaric religions. No, because all of those say, if justice has been violated, man bleeds. Nowhere do you find, if justice has been violated, God says, let me step into the story and I'll bleed. When you really think about it, substitution changes your heart like anything else. Like a self-sacrifice substitute is absolutely transformative. If you know Kimmy Scala, she's a Bloom door holder, wife of David, and she's incredible, but if you've ever heard her story, if you've ever gone over to her house, she has a whole bookshelf devoted to Harry Potter. Because if you know her that was her whole childhood, was those stories. And at the time she read them, she had actually never read the Gospels. And she'll be the first to tell you that nothing melted her heart like that story. And it wasn't the curses and the wizards and the witches. It was friendship. It was love. It was forgiveness. It was a self-sacrifice. And then she says years later, when she became a Christian, when she heard and received the gospel for the first time, she said she realized, the love of a self-sacrifice, of a substitute that melted my heart as a young child, had covers around it. But then she said, whenever she heard the gospel of Jesus Christ coming to die as her substitute, she realized, this isn't just a good story that has covers around it. No, I live in a story where the book has burst open and the God-man has come to die in my place. And so his death is inevitable and it's transactional. And then you see that it's unthinkable to the disciples, because the great irony of these 3 death predictions is after each time the disciples don't get it. He's telling it to them plainly. Like, he's not being confusing about it. He's saying, this is going to happen. And each time they're confused. He's talking about his death and they're talking about status. He's talking about ridding himself. They're talking about who's the greatest, who's the GOAT. He's counting his cost, they're counting their assets. And so what you have here is this great irony in these 3 chapters, that his sweet self-sacrifice stands in stark contrast to their self-centeredness. And so he gives us 3 discipleship lessons, because the cross does not just remove our debt, it reverses our values upside down. So 3 things about the nature of our discipleship to Jesus that we find in these 3 chapters. First, our discipleship to Jesus involves self-denial. First time Jesus predicts his death, Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus is like, you don't rebuke God. It doesn't work like that. And then at 8:34, he called the crowd to himself and he said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. What he's saying is, discipleship to me, if you are going to follow me, is going to lead you to self-denial. It is going to lead you to disassociate with, to deny, to dismiss yourself. Self-denial is the intentional disowning of yourself. It is the losing of your life. And if you're like me, you hear that and you're like, that sounds, a better translation for that is be miserable. And Jesus says, no, he flips that on the head and he says, no, you'll be miserable if you try to find your life through any finite thing here. What is the thing you must have to make you happy? If you don't have that thing, you lose all meaning. It may be career, it may be looks, it may be romance, that I need that thing to be happy. And Jesus says, exactly. You try to find ultimate meaning in that thing, and you're gonna lose your life. That'll make you miserable. Why? Because every finite thing runs into a concrete wall called death. Looks, put your ultimate hope in looks. We all turn 70 and know what happens. Romance, what do you do when the other person dies? Kids, what do you do when you can't have them? A job, what do you do when someone better comes along? Don't you see? He's saying, put your hope, find your life in any of these finite things, and they're all gonna let you down. They're all gonna run into a concrete wall called death. But I love what he says is, self-denial is not denying all desires. What he's telling you is take all of those desires for those things you must have and those things you need and move them towards me and the gospel. It is a replacement of your plans and your priorities with the plans and priorities of God. So when you deny yourself, you're not just saying, well, I hate my life, everything's terrible, sulking around. No, you're saying all of my loves, all of my ambitions, everything that I've ever longed for is in this man. That's why he says, lose it for my sake in the gospels. Why? Because there's one worldview that punches through the concrete slab called death. What does Jesus say after each time he predicts he's gonna die? I'm gonna rise. What is the hope of following this man? It doesn't end in a concrete slab. It doesn't fade. The future is lit up with eternal rays. everything you've ever hoped for. And so deny yourself and find yourself in him, because it won't be miserable, it'll be majestical. This is actually C.S. Lewis in his great work, Mere Christianity, says self-denial actually runs through all of life, and whether you know it or not, you know that is the best route to take in everything. You're like, huh? But he makes a great point. He says, you'll never make a good impression on someone, you'll never have a good first date until you quit worrying about the impression you're making, right? Or an artist they'll never truly be an original artist until they quit trying to compare themselves and make themselves original. Or we could make it modern, you'll never be able to influence people until you quit caring about how you influence people. And he goes on to say in his epic quote, which you've probably heard, is, give up yourself and you'll find your real self. Lose your life and you'll save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes. Every day, death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being and you'll find eternal life. Look for yourself and you'll find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ and you will find him, and with him, everything else thrown in. Friends, it's inevitable. Follow this man, and it is going to lead you to deny yourself. And if you are being honest and I'm being honest, there are things in our life right now, in this moment, that we must disown and we must disassociate with. And that sounds sobering and harsh, but the beauty of it is, this is the worldview that doesn't, when you lose that thing, when you deny that thing, you don't end up miserable. You don't lose your life, rather you find it. So discipleship to Jesus involves self-denial. And then chapter 9, after his second prediction, we learn that our discipleship to Jesus involves service. He predicts his death a second time in chapter 9 and then 9:33. This is fun. They're journeying after he's just told them, and he says, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And I love this. One commentator says, he said, you can't really accept this passage as realistic because it's grown men arguing about who's the greatest. And I'm like, man, have you never watched Stephen A. Smith a day in your life? Or on a more personal level, Cal Berkeley in 2016 did a study called Striving for Superiority, where they tested 700 people, and they found that the vast majority of people tested didn't just want a sense of greatness or respect or honor. What they wanted was more greatness, more respect, more honor than the people around them. There is an innate sense in us that wants to be greater than the people beside us. And to that, Jesus responds and gives us a second discipleship lesson. He pulls the disciples together in 35. He says, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. He's saying, you want greatness, you must serve. And notice he doesn't say greatness is bad. He doesn't say your desire for greatness is bad. He just reframes how you measure it. He says the world is going to measure greatness by a status, by a position, by a platform, by who's on a stage. My kingdom, my metric of measuring greatness, service. Like this is Jesus' biggest turn away from the ethics of the world. This is a bigger turn than Celsius to Fahrenheit or centimeters to inches. Like this is otherworldly way to measure greatness. Because at that time, the Greek and the Roman world, their thoughts about service were summed up in this. Plato once said, how can a man be happy when he has to serve someone? And then Jesus in the next chapter will expound on this same lesson. In chapter 10, verse 42, he says, those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over people, and the great ones exercise authority over people. He's saying, you know how the world works. The powerful people are in the position to lord, and the great ones exercise. Greatness is, let me get to a status, or let me get a position, or let me get a job where I don't have to report to people, but people report to me. Where I don't have to meet the needs of others, but people meet my needs. And Jesus will say bluntly, word for word, but it shall not be so among you. Like, imagine being at an Applebee's with Jesus. You know, you're eating a 5 for 10 or 10 for 2. I don't know. You know, they have all the deals. You two are sitting in a booth, and in the booth next to you is the President of the United States. In the booth behind him is Margaret Thatcher. And the next booth is LeBron and Jordan. And you look at Jesus, and you say, who's the greatest in this room? And it's as if he says, looks at LeBron, quickly goes past him. And then he looks at the 15-year-old waiter with the crinkled red polo and says, someone like him. What? He's like, someone like him, who the priority of their life is to meet the needs of another. That is greatness in my economy. The word he actually uses there for servant is quite literally one who waits tables. And he's saying, greatness in my kingdom is service. And so the question for you today is, I want you to think about who are the people you're going to interact with this week? Like family, roommates, neighbors, people who report to you at work, people you report to at work, people you pass through at the gym. And look at all those people you're going to interact with this week and see yourself as a servant of them. Like the priority of your week as a follower of Jesus right here is seeing yourself as a servant to them. How can you meet their needs? The priority of your week is helping them. That is the call to discipleship here. And to extend his point, Jesus puts a child in the middle and says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. The child is like a stage prop, like if I were to bring a child up right now. And he's like, serve these kind of people. And you're like, oh, I can serve cute people? Yes. And the illustration is you don't serve people who are cute and harmless in your life. No, the illustration of a child is that it is helpless and vulnerable. Who should you serve? Not people who just benefit you, not people who are just cute in your life. The helpless, the vulnerable. That is the extent of our service. And this is what made the early church stand out in the first 2 centuries. It's beautiful, and you should read about it. Rome, in times of famine, would kick kids to the curb, literally. Sick children would be thrown on the side of the road. And the Christian was the one who would look at that situation and say, us taking you in does not benefit us at all. Perhaps we risk our own health. But because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, oh, by goodness, we will replicate it. And so the Christian would serve to the extent of the helpless and the vulnerable. Why? Because we were served by Jesus. And so discipleship to Jesus, your discipleship to Jesus, is inevitably going to lead you to be concerned about, to care about, to show kindness to people who do not benefit you and do not say thank you, or do not pay you back, or do not help you back, or do not help you get to another position. No, you just serve them for the sake of serving. Why? Because he did it for us. And then the third lesson of discipleship. In chapter 10, we learn that discipleship involves suffering. Jesus predicts his death a third time. And then in chapter 10, verse 35, James and John came up to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." They're like, "Here's a blank check, Jesus. You sign it for us. Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left hand in your glory." The right and left hand were the places of greatest prominence. If you grew up in church, in a traditional church, you probably remember saying Jesus was seated at the right hand of God Almighty. To be seated at the right hand and the left hand was like the chief of staff and the prime minister. They're saying, when you get to power, can we be on your cabinet? And again, notice their focus is positional. It's not missional at all. It's when you get to this status, can we have this status? And one interesting detail is notice the two people asking. A couple chapters later, what we talked about last week is at the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus took 3 people with him, Peter, James, and John. And now James and John scheme up a little move, leave Peter aside and say, when you get to power, can we be the ones next to you? Leave Peter out. And then Jesus will respond to him in verse 38. You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And he's saying, you don't understand. The same way that the way to greatness is service, the way to glory in my kingdom will be suffering. When they're asking, hey, can we be, Jesus, when you're at your moment of great glory, can we be on your left and your right hand? Where is Jesus Christ on his moment of great glory? He's on a cross. There's two thieves beside him. They don't know what they're asking. The way to glory is through suffering. And then notice he mentions two objects or two things, a cup and a baptism. In each discipleship lesson, he brings up some sort of image or illustration. When he talks about self-denial, he says, pick up your cross. When he talks about service, he pulls the child. And here, when he talks about suffering, he mentions a cup and a baptism. What is the cup and the baptism? The cup in the Old Testament had rich language about it. Sometimes would be used to joy and salvation. Maybe you're familiar with David saying, my cup overflows with joy. But more often than not, it was used in relation to suffering and wrath. And here, that is what Jesus is talking about. I am going to drink the cup of eternal justice, of eternal wrath that was coming towards you. Give it to me. I'm going to drink it. And then he says, I'm going to be baptized. Baptism, he's not talking about the ritual or the sacrament that we would do up here because he's already been baptized. He's talking about baptized like I did in 8th grade when someone got dunked on. Like, they got baptized. To be engulfed with something, immersed by something, an overwhelming experience. And he's saying, I am going to be engulfed in agony, consumed in calamity. I am going to, the great way to glory is through suffering. Give me the cup, I'll drink it. Let the storm hit me, I'll drown. Why? For the sake of you. And then the disciples really don't understand what he's asking because they said, us too. But what Jesus is rhetorically saying is, you can't do that. Your cup isn't going to have that in it. The storm that hits you isn't the storm of justice that'll hit me. But he does say, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. He's saying, you're going to have a cup too. You're going to be hit by a storm too. Same cup, same storm, different waves, different content. He is going to consume your punishment on your behalf so that you never have to taste that cup. He flips the cup upside down, nothing comes out. He's going to be consumed by a storm that you'll never have to bear. But you will face a cup and you will face a baptism. You will suffer following Jesus Christ. Like, I can't deny it. Following Jesus is going to lead you to suffer. You will suffer forgiving people. You will suffer serving people when they don't pay you compliments back and no one notices. You may suffer losing a job because of your allegiance to this man. You may suffer and lose friendships of 5 years because you've fallen in love with him. You may have a cup, you may have a baptism, but you'll drink it and you'll bear it. Why? Because you saw that he drank the ultimate one for you. In one of Thornton Wilder's The Great American Playwrights plays, he says, wonderfully, I love this quote. He says, without your wounds, where would your power be? It is your melancholy that makes your low voice tremble into the hearts of men and women. In love's service, only wounded soldiers can serve. In love's service, as we associate with this man, as we love this Jesus Christ, we will be wounded soldiers. But it's worth it. Why? Because you suffer for the sake of love. You don't suffer for the sake of suffering. You suffer for the sake of love. And lastly, our discipleship to Jesus is done inside of his sacrifice. He ends his third and final discipleship lesson in 10 verse 43 and says, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He says, the reason you deny yourself, the reason you serve others, the reason you take the hit and you suffer is not because they're the ethical things to do. It is because it is for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Just think about that sentence for a moment. The Son of Man, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came to earth not to be served, but to serve you and give his life for you. That is mind-blowing. What is the essence of a servant? Someone who gives. What is the essence of who God is? Someone who gives. He came not to be served, but to serve and give his life for you. The great motive of discipleship is not buckle up your straps. It is gratitude in sight of his sacrifice. Ernest Gordon was a British Army officer in World War II, and he was captured at sea and sent to work on the Burma Railway Line, also known as the Death Railway. Thousands of prisoners struggled in 120-degree heat, bare bodies, little to no food. Many dropped dead of exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. If any appeared to be lagging, a guard would murder them on the spot. Under these terrible conditions, tens of thousands of prisoners died. And the environment was so harsh that interaction among the prisoners degenerated into selfish behavior, every man for themselves, not looking out for one another. And then Ernest Gordon speaks of this one day that kind of changed everything. Because the guards carefully counted tools at the end of each day, and one day, after a day's work, they noticed a shovel was missing. And so assuming that someone was using it to plan an attack, immediately they said, all die unless someone comes forward. And without a hesitation, a man stepped forward and said, it was I. And they killed him on the spot. And that evening, the tools were counted again, and they realized there was a miscount. And word spread like rapid fire throughout the prison. An innocent man had been willing to die to save others. And the incident had a rippling effect on the rest of the prisoners. The self-sacrifice of one changed the community. They began to treat each other like brothers and look out for one another when they were once selfish and every man for themselves. And when the Allies won and swept in, the survivors lined up in front of their captors, and instead of attacking them or repaying them or paying them back, they insisted, no more hatred, no more killing. Now what we need is forgiveness. The sight of a sacrifice changed a community. Do you see the picture? You see, you hear stories like that, or you read fiction or nonfiction stories like that, and your heart is warmed. But if I'm being blunt with you, you're gonna forget it in 3 weeks. Your heart's warmed for a second. Maybe you walk out of the theaters crying, but you go on with your life. The sight of someone else dying for another will warm your heart. Oh, but the sight of the Son of God dying for you will transform your heart. That is the love you've been looking for all along. The great hymn goes, and can it be that I should gain an interest in the Savior's blood? Died he for me who caused this pain? For me who him to death pursued? Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? He's the love you've been looking for your entire life. He's the hero come to die for you.